Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we plunge into the shadows of history long before capes and castles, into the primordial ooze of human fear. Imagine, if you will, the flickering firelight of a cave tens of thousands of years ago. You're huddled with your tribe, the wind howling like a hungry beast just beyond the entrance. Every rustle in the dark, every strange sound from the forest sends a shiver down your spine. Is it just a predator or something else? Something that defies the natural order, something that once breathed but now doesn't, yet still moves. You clutch your crude spear, your heart thumping a frantic rhythm against your ribs, because deep down you know it's not just the living you have to worry about. You probably won't survive this, but hey, at least we'll learn something. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're brave enough, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking through a landscape that feels both alien and strangely familiar. A world where the lines between life and death are terrifyingly thin. It's not about charming counts or seductive fangs yet. This is about the primal, guttural fear of the undead. Think back to the earliest human settlements, those fragile bubbles of existence surrounded by an untamed wilderness. Death was a constant companion, abrupt and often inexplicable. A healthy person could be vibrant one day and cold the next, struck down by illness, accident, or the sharp claws of a saber-toothed cat. And what happened to the spark that animated them? Where did it go? More unsettlingly, what if it didn't go far at all? This wasn't a philosophical question, it was a terrifyingly practical one. If the essence of a person, their spirit or their energy, could linger, what was to stop it from lingering with ill intent? You watch as ancient shamans perform rituals, their bodies painted with ochre, their voices chanting to the rhythm of unseen drums. They're trying to appease, to ward off, to control. Because even then, humanity intuitively grasped that death wasn't always the end. Sometimes it was just a transition, and not always a peaceful one. The earliest archaeological evidence of unusual burial practices hints at this deep-seated anxiety. You see bodies weighed down with stones, buried face down, or even decapitated. Not out of disrespect, but out of a desperate, terrifying hope that such measures would prevent the deceased from ever bothering the living again. Imagine the sheer terror that must have gripped a community when a loved one, after burial, was somehow seen again, or when misfortune befell the family that seemed directly linked to the recently departed. This wasn't just grief, it was a profound, existential dread. Historians still argue whether these earliest anomalies point to a widespread belief in reanimated corpses, or simply an attempt to ensure a peaceful afterlife, free from the spiritual entanglement of the living and the dead. But the very existence of these practices suggests a fear of something returning. You trudge through a primeval forest, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. Every shadow seems to writhe, every creak of a branch sounds like an approaching footstep. Your ancestors weren't just afraid of bears, they were afraid of what used to be a person, but wasn't anymore. They were afraid of the hungry ghost, the vengeful spirit, the entity that couldn't or wouldn't move on. This foundational fear, this whisper of the restless dead, is the true beginning of our journey into the vampire myth. It predates any specific name or form. It's the universal human recognition that death can leave an echo, a presence, a hunger. And sometimes that hunger isn't for peace, but for life itself. It's the chilling thought that what was once yours, your very essence, could be desired by something that no longer has its own. Think about the first time a person looked at a corpse, at the stillness, the coldness, the utter lack of life, and yet felt a strange unease, a sense that something wasn't quite right. Why did the body stay if the person was gone? What if a part of them wasn't gone? This isn't rational thought. It's instinctual, gut-level horror. The concept of the soul, or spirit, has been a part of human belief systems for millennia, and with it, the equally ancient fear that this soul might not always find its way to eternal rest. Perhaps it was tethered to the earthly plane by unfinished business, by a violent death, or simply by pure malevolence. And what did these tethered spirits do? They didn't just float harmlessly about. Oh no! They caused sickness, they brought bad luck, they whispered in your dreams, and sometimes they demanded sustenance. perhaps a little bit of your own life force to keep them going. You watch as a prehistoric community struggles with a mysterious illness that sweeps through their camp, taking lives without explanation. They don't have microscopes. They don't understand germs. What they see is a pattern, a malevolent force. And when the person who died last seems to be seen by others in their fever dreams, or when their grave is found disturbed by animals, the fear solidifies. It must be them. The recently deceased, returning, somehow feeding on the living, drawing out their warmth, their vitality. It's a surprisingly rational conclusion for a pre-scientific mind. If life is energy, and someone is losing energy, then something else must be gaining it, right? It's a bit like wondering why your phone battery drains so fast. You don't immediately blame the ghost in the machine, but your ancestors might have. This initial, amorphous fear of the undying is less about sharp teeth and more about a pervasive chill, a feeling of being watched, of something unseen draining your vitality. It's the precursor to every specific legend. Before there were rules about garlic or steaks, there was just the overwhelming dread that death wasn't always a one-way trip, and sometimes the return ticket came at a horrifying price for the living. This primal fear, woven into the very fabric of early human existence, forms the bedrock upon which millennia of undead lore would be built, shifting and evolving with each new culture, each new set of anxieties. But the core fear, that the dead might not stay dead and might want something from you, that remains. You fast forward through the epochs, past the last ice age, past the first tentative steps of agriculture, until you find yourself amidst the sun-baked mud-brick cities of ancient Mesopotamia. Here, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, civilization blossoms, and with it, a more sophisticated, though no less terrifying, understanding of the restless dead. You stand in the shadow of a towering ziggurat, its terraced levels reaching towards a sky that, even then, held both promise and dread. The people bustling around you, scribes with their clay tablets, merchants haggling over grain, and priests tending their altars, all share a common, deeply ingrained belief. The dead, particularly the unquiet dead, were a problem. The Mesopotamians, pioneers of writing and law, developed complex religious systems that included a chilling understanding of the afterlife. They envisioned the underworld, or the land of no return, as a dusty, dark realm, a place where spirits or giddim ate dust and clay. Sounds like a fun vacation, right? But the catch was, not all giddim stayed put. If a person died violently, if they were not properly buried, if their family neglected their funerary offerings, or if they simply held a powerful grudge in life, their spirit might escape the underworld's confines. And when they escaped, they didn't exactly come back for a polite cup of tea. You walk through a crowded market, the scent of spices and sweat in the air, but beneath the mundane activity, you sense a current of underlying fear. These restless spirits, these giddim, were believed to cause all manner of misfortune. They could bring sickness, ruin crops, torment families with nightmares, or even physically assault the living. Imagine waking up in the pre-dawn hours, a cold dread seizing you, convinced that the shadowy figure at the foot of your bed isn't a bad dream, but the angry giddim of your neglectful neighbour, demanding the respect they never received in life. Or perhaps the offerings their descendants failed to provide. It's enough to make you set up an automatic payment for grave maintenance, isn't it? The Mesopotamians weren't passive victims, however. They developed an elaborate system of rituals and incantations to deal with these malevolent entities. You see priests known as a shipu performing exorcisms, chanting intricate spells etched onto clay tablets. These weren't just simple prayers, they were detailed, precise instructions designed to coerce, placate, or banish the giddim. One common strategy involved sympathetic magic, creating effigies of the deceased, or even figures representing the disease or misfortune they brought, and then ritually destroying them. It was a bit like hitting the refresh button on the afterlife, hoping the ghost would finally get the hint and return to where it belonged. One mainstream historical fact from this period is the sheer volume of surviving cuneiform tablets that detail these magical and religious practices. Thousands upon thousands of these clay documents, painstakingly inscribed, reveal a society deeply preoccupied with maintaining harmony between the living and the dead. They weren't just worried about invading armies or crop failure. The unseen world, brimming with potential malevolence, was an equally pressing concern. This wasn't just folklore for children, it was a sophisticated theological and practical system. A quirky or fringe tidbit from Mesopotamian belief involves the concept of the Akimu, a particularly nasty type of Giddim. Unlike other spirits, the Akimu was often described as being able to not only haunt, but also to possess the living, or even consume their life force. While not explicitly vampiric in the blood-drinking sense, the Akimu embodied that ancient fear of a deceased entity draining the vitality of the living. It was the ultimate nightmare, losing control of your own body, or feeling your strength ebb away, all at the hands of a revenant. They were the original energy vampires, long before that term became a synonym for annoying colleagues. You observe a family performing their daily rituals, setting out food and drink for their ancestors, not just out of love, but out of a desperate need to keep them content. This concept of reciprocal offerings was crucial. If you fed the dead, they might leave you alone. If you didn't, well, that's when you might find yourself facing an Akimu with a serious case of the munchies. Historians still argue whether the Giddim and Akimu represent distinct categories of spirits or different manifestations of the same underlying fear of the unquiet dead. But the consensus remains. The Mesopotamians certainly believed that some dead people didn't stay dead, and they could definitely make your life miserable. The threat of the Giddim also influenced burial practices. While not as overtly restrictive as later cultures, there was a clear emphasis on proper interment and ritual purity. Bodies were laid to rest, often with personal possessions in graves that were meant to be undisturbed. Any breach of this sacred space, whether by grave robbers or natural forces, could potentially unleash a restless spirit. The entire cosmology was built on a delicate balance. The gods, the living, and the dead each had their place, and disruptions to this order brought chaos and suffering. Imagine a society where every cough, every fever, every patch of bad luck could be attributed to a disgruntled ancestor who wasn't getting enough barley cakes in their grave. It puts a lot of pressure on funeral caterers, doesn't it? The Mesopotamian belief system, with its detailed catalogue of spirits and elaborate protective measures, represents a significant step in the evolution of the undead myth. It moved beyond the amorphous dread of early humans to a more codified, almost bureaucratic approach to dealing with the deceased. There were specific names, specific causes for unrest, and specific remedies. This wasn't just fear. It was an attempt to understand, categorize, and ultimately control the unpredictable nature of death's aftermath. You see the echoes of these early concerns in every subsequent culture that grappled with the notion of the dead returning. Even the very act of living, of thriving, could be seen as an affront to a neglected Giddim. If you were too prosperous, too happy, too successful, you might draw the unwanted attention of a spirit yearning for the life it no longer possessed. This added a layer of fatalism to their daily lives. Even good fortune could come with a supernatural price tag. It teaches you to be humble, perhaps, or at least to make sure your dead relatives are well fed and pacified. You observe a small clay figure, crudely shaped like a person, being bound with string and then broken. This is a common practice, a ritual intended to kill the Giddim once and for all, or at least send it back to the underworld. It's a desperate measure, born of desperate fear. The fear of something that defies the natural cycle, something that should be gone but isn't, something that feeds on your very well-being. This Mesopotamian vampire, though lacking the Gothic romance we associate with the term today, embodies the raw, ancient terror of the parasitic revenant. It's not about seduction, it's about survival. It's about ensuring that when you close your eyes at night, the things that go bump aren't just rats in the walls, but something far, far worse. You leave the arid plains of Mesopotamia behind and journey westward, following the life-giving Nile until you arrive in ancient Egypt. Here, the sun beats down on monumental tombs and towering pyramids, testaments to a civilization utterly consumed by the concept of the afterlife. While the Mesopotamians feared a chaotic underworld from which spirits might escape, the Egyptians meticulously planned for a structured, orderly transition. But even with all their elaborate preparations, a deep-seated anxiety about the dead refusing to stay dead, or even worse, becoming actively malevolent, persisted. You walk through a vast necropolis, the air dry and dusty, filled with the faint scent of myrrh and natron. Every tomb, from the humble pit grave to the most opulent royal burial chamber, was a carefully constructed bridge to eternity. The Egyptians believed in multiple components of the human soul: the ka, the life force, the the bar, the personality or spiritual essence that could travel between the living and the dead, and the ak, the perfected, transfigured spirit of the justified dead. The goal of all funerary rituals was to ensure the bar and car could reunite with the mummified body, allowing the deceased to become an ak and continue their journey into the field of reeds, their blissful paradise. But what if this process failed? What if a person died a bad death? Violently, suddenly, or without proper burial rites? What if their tomb was plundered, or their name erased? These unfortunate souls risk becoming unquiet dead, their bar unable to find rest, their car lingering as a shadow, unable to unite with their body. And these lingering spirits, far from benign, were often believed to be malevolent. They weren't necessarily blood drinkers in the classic sense, but they were certainly energy drainers, sanity snatchers, and bringers of misfortune. Imagine preparing for your eternal journey, only for some grave robber to show up with a crowbar and ruin your afterlife commute. You'd be pretty miffed too, wouldn't you? You observe a funerary procession, the air thick with the lamentations of professional mourners. The embalmers, those highly skilled morticians of antiquity, were not just preserving bodies, they were safeguarding the soul's eternal home. Every step of the mummification process, from the removal of organs to the wrapping in linen bandages and the placing of protective amulets, was a magical act designed to prevent the deceased from becoming a wandering, dangerous entity. The more elaborate the mummification, the less likely the deceased was to cause trouble for the living. It was like an ancient spiritual insurance policy, ensuring your loved ones wouldn't come back to haunt your pyramid schemes. A mainstream historical fact here is the incredible preservation of bodies through mummification. This practice, unique in its scale and sophistication, directly reflects the Egyptian obsession with the physical integrity of the corpse as a vessel for the soul's journey. It wasn't just about showing off wealth, it was about preventing the deceased from becoming a restless revenant. If the body decayed too much, or was damaged, the soul could not properly inhabit it, leaving it in a state of perpetual limbo, a perfect recipe for a malevolent spirit. A quirky or fringe tidbit from Egyptian beliefs involves the rare but recorded instances of curses placed upon tombs, not just by priests to ward off robbers, but implicitly by the deceased themselves. Some inscriptions warn of the deceased seizing the living like a bird, or making the nose of the violator stink, which some scholars interpret as a veiled threat of ghostly retribution, or even the transmission of disease by an angry spirit. While not a direct vampire, it embodies the active malevolence of an unquiet dead, capable of inflicting harm on the living. It's the ancient equivalent of putting a "Beware of Dog" sign on your tomb, except the dog is a vengeful spirit. You see images carved on tomb walls depicting offerings being made to the deceased. Food, drink, incense. These weren't just tokens of remembrance, they were vital sustenance for the car and bar in the afterlife. Neglect these offerings, and you risked the deceased growing hungry, not just for spiritual nourishment, but perhaps for the vitality of the living. This fear of a hungry dead resonates deeply with later vampiric lore. The idea that a deceased entity might draw sustenance from the living, even if not explicitly blood, is a core component. Historians still argue whether some of the more ambiguous texts describe spirits that actively drain vital fluids, or simply cause a more general decline in health and fortune. The Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and prayers, served as a guidebook for the deceased's journey through the underworld, filled with incantations to ward off hostile demons and ensure safe passage. But some of these spells also acted as protection for the living, implicitly acknowledging the danger posed by those who failed to navigate the afterlife successfully. The Egyptians didn't just worry about what was in the tomb, they worried about what could come out of it. Consider the tales of walking dead that occasionally surfaced in Egyptian folklore, particularly concerning those who died of plague or in other mysterious circumstances. While not widespread, the idea that a corpse might somehow reanimate and move among the living was a terrifying possibility. The meticulous burial rituals were, in part, a countermeasure against this, ensuring the body was properly put to rest and wouldn't feel the urge to wander. Imagine the collective sigh of relief when the tomb was sealed, not just for the deceased's peace, but for the community's safety. Even the animal kingdom played a role in their fears. The crocodile, a creature that emerged from water and consumed flesh, was sometimes associated with chaos and malevolence, including the potential to disrupt the dead. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from the earlier parts of our historical ramble? Well, the beast itself could be an even bigger problem for your eternal rest. The threat of animals disturbing graves and thus releasing potentially malevolent spirits led to careful tomb construction and the placement of guardians, both physical and magical. The elaborate cult of the dead in ancient Egypt, while aiming for eternal bliss, implicitly contained within it a deep-seated apprehension about what happened when things went wrong. The sheer amount of effort poured into mummification, tomb construction, and daily offering speaks volumes about the very real fear that if the dead were not properly appeased, they would become a source of affliction for the living. This wasn't just a cultural eccentricity, it was a fundamental response to the terrifying uncertainty of death and its lingering effects. So, while you won't find any direct counterparts to Dracula lurking in the shadows of the pyramids, you do find the fertile ground for the vampire myth. The concept of a deceased entity draining life force, returning to haunt the living, and needing specific rituals to be put to rest, these are all present in the Egyptian worldview. They might not have called them vampires, but the fear of the hungry dead, the restless spirit and the malevolent revenant was as real and tangible as the desert sun. It's another crucial step in the long winding lineage of our favourite nocturnal creatures. Leaving the grand, sun-drenched monuments of Egypt behind, you drift across the Mediterranean, landing amidst the vibrant city-states of ancient Greece. Here, under the bright Aegean sun, a different tapestry of fear is woven, one populated by shades, spectres and vengeful spirits. The Greeks, renowned for their philosophy, democracy and epic poetry, also possessed a rich and often terrifying mythology of the underworld and its restless inhabitants. You find yourself in a bustling agora, the scent of olive oil and baked bread mingling with the lively chatter of philosophers and merchants. But beneath the surface of this rational, human-centric society lurked a profound respect and often fear for the dead. Unlike the Egyptians, who meticulously prepared the body for an active afterlife, the Greeks generally believed that the majority of the dead descended to Hades, a gloomy realm where they existed as insubstantial idola, or shades, mere echoes of their former selves devoid of memory or personality. Sounds a bit depressing, doesn't it? Like an eternal Monday morning meeting, but with more dust. Yet, there were exceptions, terrifying exceptions. Souls that had not received proper burial rites, those who died violently or prematurely, or those consumed by powerful anger or injustice in life, might find themselves unable to cross the river Styx or be bound to the mortal realm. These were the vengeful spirits, the Keres or Phasmata, who could inflict harm upon the living. They weren't just sad, ethereal wisps. They were active agents of misfortune, disease and madness. Imagine being haunted not by a ghost, but by the furious echo of someone you wronged in life, whispering curses in your ear, making your crops wither, or causing your children to fall ill. It would certainly make you think twice before cutting someone off in traffic, wouldn't it? You observe a family performing a simple but solemn burial, pouring libations of wine and honey onto the earth, covering the deceased with earth, and placing coins on their eyes to pay Charon, the ferryman of the underworld. These rituals were paramount. Without them, the soul was condemned to wander aimlessly, becoming a potentially malevolent force. The emphasis wasn't on preserving the body, but on ensuring the proper passage of the soul. A forgotten ritual was not just a social gaffe, it was an invitation to supernatural disaster. One mainstream historical fact from this era is the significance of chthonic deities and hero cults. The Greeks propitiated gods of the underworld like Hades and Persephone, and often revered deceased heroes, performing rituals at their tombs. These practices were not merely acts of worship, but also forms of appeasement, ensuring that these powerful forces and spirits remained benevolent, or, at the very least, neutral towards the living. It was a careful balance of respect and fear. A quirky or fringe tidbit concerns the lead curse tablets, Difixions, found throughout the Greek world. These small sheets of lead, inscribed with curses and folded or rolled before being placed in graves, wells or temples, were intended to bind or harm a rival. While aimed at the living, some scholars suggest that the placement in graves was intended to enlist the help of a restless or powerful deceased spirit to carry out the curse. It's a bit like outsourcing your vengeance to the underworld, a truly ancient form of spiritual hit job. You see a group of women, the Maenads, participating in ecstatic rituals. sometimes described as tearing apart sacrificial animals and consuming raw flesh. While not directly linked to the undead, these rituals hint at a primal, unsettling connection between blood, frenzy, and the divine or supernatural. This visceral engagement with life and death, with consumption and offering, subtly echoes the later hungers attributed to the undead. Historians still argue whether the Menedic rituals had any conceptual overlap with beliefs in life-draining entities, or if they were purely religious expressions. The concept of the Lamia also emerges in Greek folklore, a terrifying female demon who seduces men and then devours them or their children, often draining their blood. While initially a Libyan queen transformed by Hera's curse into a child-eating monster, her myth evolves to include vampiric characteristics. She is a creature of the night, beautiful and alluring, yet utterly predatory. This marks a significant development towards the seductive monster archetype that would later define the vampire. You could almost hear a dramatic cello solo playing in the background as she appears. Another figure of dread was the Empusa, a shape-shifting phantom often depicted with one leg of brass and one of a donkey, who also preyed on men, sometimes drinking their blood or feeding on their life force. These weren't mere allegories. They were concrete dangers in the popular imagination, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the unwary. The Greeks might have built temples to reason, but they still kept an eye on the dark corners where irrational horrors dwelled. The Greeks also practiced various apotropaic, evil-averting rituals to protect themselves from these entities. You might see garlic hung over doorways or iron used in burials, not as direct anti-vampire measures, but as general safeguards against malevolent spirits. The emphasis on proper burial, however, remained paramount. An improperly buried body could become a vrikolakas, a revenant similar to later Balkan vampires, reanimating and causing trouble. This fear of a physically reanimated corpse, rather than just a lingering spirit, is a crucial step towards the vampire as we know it. Consider the tales of Orpheus venturing into the underworld to retrieve Eurydice. His journey highlights the Greek belief in the distinct separation of the living and the dead, and the immense difficulty, almost impossibility, of breaching that barrier. Those who did, or who were forced back, were fundamentally unnatural and dangerous. The dead were meant to stay dead, and any transgression of that boundary was fraught with peril. The fear wasn't just of the grotesque, it was also of the insidious. Some spirits were believed to cause gradual wasting diseases, to steal sleep, or to bring about a slow, inexplicable decline in health or prosperity. This aligns perfectly with the energy-draining aspect of early vampiric beliefs. You wouldn't wake up with 2 puncture marks on your neck, but you might feel inexplicably weaker each day, as if some unseen entity was slowly siphoning away your vitality. It's like a spiritual tax on your life force, and the ancient Greeks believed the dead were sometimes the collectors. So while the Greek pantheon was filled with powerful gods and goddesses, the common person still lived with the nagging fear of the unquiet dead. The precise ritual, the correct offering, the respectful burial, all were vital to ensure that the shades remained shades, and the vengeful spirits stayed where they belonged, far from the world of the living. The Greek contribution to the vampire myth lies in its development of specific predatory female figures like the Lamia and Empusa, and the lingering fear of the improperly laid to rest, foreshadowing the physical revenants to come. From the classical grandeur of Greece, you traverse the Mediterranean once more, arriving in the mighty Roman Empire. Here, amidst the grandeur of marble forums and the thunder of legionary boots, you discover a pragmatic yet deeply superstitious culture, one that meticulously categorized its spirits and feared the night-walking dead as much as any barbarian horde. The Romans, inheritors of Greek traditions but with their own distinct flair, had a pantheon of restless spirits that stalked the living demanding respect, or worse, sustenance. You stand in a bustling Roman street, the sounds of carts rumbling over cobblestones, vendors hawking their wares, and the distant roar of the Colosseum filling the air. For all their engineering marvels and legal codes, the Romans were profoundly attuned to the unseen world. Their household religion centered on the lares, protective ancestral spirits, and the penates, guardians of the pantry, who, when properly honoured, ensured the well-being of the family. But just as there were benevolent spirits, there were also the terrifyingly malevolent. The most notorious of these were the lemures and the larvae. These were the restless, often terrifying ghosts of the dead, particularly those who had died tragically, prematurely, or without proper burial rites. Unlike the benevolent Lares, the lemures and larvae were entities to be feared and placated. They were believed to cause madness, illness, bad luck, and generally drain the vitality of the living. Imagine trying to explain to your Roman neighbour that you're feeling a bit run down because the ghost of an unburied gladiator keeps siphoning your virtues while you sleep. They'd probably nod sagely and recommend a strong apotropaic charm. You observe a Roman family performing the annual Lemuria festival in May, a private household ritual where the paterfamilias, the head of the household, would rise at midnight, walk barefoot through the house, spitting black beans 9 times over his shoulder, and clashing bronze pots to scare away the malevolent lemures. It was less a joyous celebration, and more an act of ritualistic self-defense. This mainstream historical fact highlights the widespread fear of these spirits, and the prescribed methods for their banishment. It wasn't just a quirky local custom, it was a deeply ingrained religious practice to protect the very fabric of the home. It makes your spring cleaning look pretty tame, doesn't it? A quirky or fringe tidbit concerns the Strix, a nocturnal bird associated with ill omens and often described in Roman literature as a creature that would feed on the blood of infants. Ovid, in his Fasti, vividly describes the Strix swooping down to attack a baby in its cradle, piercing its tiny body and drawing blood. While depicted as a bird, its characteristics, preying on the innocent, feeding on blood, nocturnal habits, align chillingly with later vampiric traits, suggesting a deeper ancient fear of such entities. It's the original "don't let the bedbugs bite" warning, but with more feathers and far more serious consequences. The Romans also meticulously observed burial rites. Cremation was common, but whether buried or cremated, the proper rituals were essential. A body left unburied, or a grave desecrated, was an invitation for the deceased spirit to become a larva, endlessly wandering and seeking to torment the living. The fear wasn't just of the ghost itself, but of the disruption it caused to the social and cosmic order. A spirit unable to find rest was a public nuisance, and a private terror. Historians still argue whether the physical descriptions of lemures and larvae in Roman texts imply a belief in truly reanimated corpses, or simply particularly malevolent palpable apparitions. You see a Roman woman wearing an amulet, perhaps of coral or a phallus, intended to ward off evil. These weren't just fashion accessories. They were crucial protective devices against the omnipresent threats of the unseen world, including the lemures. The Roman home, for all its material comforts, was a constant battleground against unseen forces that could infiltrate and cause chaos. The concept of necromancy, or communication with the dead, also existed in Roman society, often viewed with a mixture of fear and fascination. While some sought wisdom from the dead, there was always the inherent danger of disturbing restless spirits and unleashing their malevolence. It's like calling customer service for the afterlife. You might get what you want, but you might also get put on hold indefinitely, or unleash something truly awful. Roman funerary monuments, though often grand, were also designed to contain. Epitaphs would frequently include phrases wishing for the deceased to rest in peace. Sit tibi terra levis, may the earth be light upon you. Not just as a sentimental farewell, but as a genuine plea to the earth to hold the body securely, preventing any unquiet stirrings. The emphasis was on keeping the dead in the grave, away from the living. Consider the terrifying tales of Roman battlefields, where fallen soldiers, unburied and left to rot, were believed to rise as vengeful spectres, haunting the living and bringing bad fortune to armies. The fear of the unburied dead was a very real military and spiritual concern. Such revenants were not just ghosts, they were a physical manifestation of chaos and disrespect, a chilling reminder of duty unfulfilled. Even the everyday Roman experience could be touched by these fears. Unexplained illnesses, a sudden string of bad luck, or persistent nightmares could all be attributed to the malevolent influence of a larva. The symptoms align eerily with later descriptions of vampiric draining. A gradual decline, a loss of vitality, a creeping sense of dread. It wasn't always about a sudden attack. Sometimes it was the slow, insidious siphoning of your life force. The Romans, for all their advancements, remained deeply rooted in an ancient fear of the dead returning. Their categorizations of spirits, their elaborate rites of passage, and their specific festivals for appeasing the unquiet dead demonstrate a nuanced yet pervasive anxiety. The lemures and larvae, while not the fanged aristocratic vampires of later literature, embody the fundamental threat of the deceased refusing to stay buried, returning to the world of the living to inflict harm and, most terrifyingly, to feed on the vitality of those still breathing. Their contribution solidifies the notion of the restless dead as a distinct category of malevolent entity, capable of insidious harm. Leaving the structured urban fears of ancient Rome behind, you journey eastward and northward, past the crumbling frontiers of empires, into the vast ancient forests and sprawling plains of Eastern Europe. Here, in the misty, often isolated villages of the Slavic peoples, the concept of the vampire, as we begin to recognise it, truly takes root and blossoms into a terrifyingly concrete form. This is where the amorphous fears of ancient revenants begin to coalesce into something chillingly familiar. You find yourself in a small remote village, perhaps in medieval Serbia or Bulgaria, nestled deep within a forested valley. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. Life here is hard, precarious, and intimately tied to the cycles of nature and the vagaries of fate. Death is a constant presence, often sudden and brutal, brought by disease, famine, or the harsh grip of winter. And in this harsh reality, the line between life and death, between the living and the unliving, becomes terrifyingly blurred. The Slavic peoples, across their various tribes and evolving nations, shared a rich tapestry of folklore, much of it steeped in animism and a profound respect for the natural world and its darker supernatural inhabitants. Unlike the structured underworlds of the Greeks or the carefully managed afterlives of the Egyptians, the Slavic concept of the afterlife was often more fluid, more immediate. The dead were not always distant shades. They could linger, they could return, and they could hunger. The word itself, vampire, is widely believed to have Slavic origins, entering Western European languages from forms like the Serbian vampir or the Russian upir. This linguistic lineage underscores the profound depth of the belief in these regions. It wasn't just a fleeting ghost story. It was a deeply ingrained, tangible threat that shaped burial customs, daily rituals, and communal anxieties. Imagine living in a village where every unexplained death, every sudden illness, every crop failure could be attributed not to natural causes, but to the malevolent influence of a returned corpse from the village graveyard. You'd probably keep a very close eye on your neighbours, wouldn't you? You observe a funeral in this village, distinct from the Roman or Egyptian rites. The body is prepared, but often with an almost paranoid precision. Precautions against its return. Perhaps iron tools are placed in the coffin, or thorns are driven through the body. These weren't mere superstitions. They were vital, desperate acts of self-preservation against a very real and present danger. The mainstream historical fact here is the pervasiveness of folk beliefs in revenants across Slavic lands, far more specific and physical than in earlier cultures. These were not just ghosts, they were reanimated corpses. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the belief in certain Slavic regions that individuals born with a caul, a remnant of the amniotic sac covering the head at birth, were predisposed to becoming vampires after death. Other birth anomalies, like being born with teeth or being conceived on a holy day, could also mark a person for this horrifying fate. It added a layer of fatalism and suspicion to the already fraught circumstances of birth and death. It's like a cosmic lottery you really don't want to win. The Slavic vampire or vampire was typically described as a reanimated corpse that left its grave at night to torment the living, often by sucking their blood or draining their vitality. This is where the core characteristic of blood drinking truly takes centre stage. These creatures weren't ethereal, they were solid, fleshy, and terrifyingly real. They might spread disease, strangle people in their sleep, or simply cause a slow-wasting sickness. The method of attack varied, but the outcome was always the same, a gradual loss of life force for the victim. Historians still argue whether the blood-drinking aspect was a literal interpretation of observed illness, like anemia or paleness, or a symbolic representation of a deeper predatory drain on a community's well-being. You see a family nervously watching the grave of a recently deceased relative, particularly if that person had been unusual in life, perhaps an outcast, a sorcerer, or someone who simply died in an unlucky way, like suicide. Such individuals were considered prime candidates for becoming a vampire. The fear was not just of the unknown, but of the neighbour, the friend, the loved one, returning from the grave transformed into something monstrous. This added a layer of psychological terror to the physical threat. The various physical descriptions of Slavic vampires also painted a gruesome picture. They were often described as bloated, with ruddy complexions due to the blood they had consumed, sometimes with long nails and hair, and occasionally a foul odour. They were not the elegant creatures of later fiction. They were monstrous, terrifyingly grotesque reflections of corrupted death. Imagine your recently deceased aunt, looking decidedly undeceased, coming back to visit, but looking like she's had a few too many plates of pierogi and a bad case of the flu. Not exactly the reunion you'd hope for. Methods of prevention and destruction were equally specific and often brutal. Driving a stake through the heart was a common and widespread method, but other techniques included decapitation, burning the corpse, reburying it face down, placing garlic in the mouth, or even driving nails through the body. The goal was always the same: to physically incapacitate the revenant and prevent its further depredations. The sheer variety and commonality of these methods highlight the deeply held belief in the physical reality of these creatures. The Slavic belief system often blurred the lines between witches, sorcerers, and vampires. A living person who practiced malevolent magic might be destined to become a vampire in death. This added another layer of social anxiety. Who among you was secretly practicing dark arts, and who would soon become the source of your terror? It was a constant whisper of suspicion running through the tight-knit communities. The concept of the undead wolf or were-creatures also occasionally intersected with vampire lore in some Slavic traditions, adding another layer of bestial horror to the human revenant. The transformation was not always into a perfectly preserved, elegant figure, but sometimes into something grotesque, animalistic, and utterly terrifying. The transition from a living human to a vampire was often believed to be triggered by specific events: an unbaptized child's death, an excommunication, a curse, or even simply being chosen by an existing vampire. This meant that the threat could arise from within the community itself, making the danger even more intimate and insidious. It wasn't a distant monster. It could be the person you knew best now returned as a horror. The Slavic contribution is pivotal because it gives us the vampire, a physically reanimated corpse, often specifically a blood drinker, identifiable by certain characteristics, and susceptible to particular methods of destruction. This is the proto-vampire, raw and terrifying, stripped of later romanticism. It embodies the deep-seated peasant fears of contagion, inexplicable death, and the terror of the familiar becoming monstrous. This is the direct ancestor of our modern vampire waiting in the cold, hard earth of Eastern Europe. Leaving the shadowed forests of Slavic lands, you journey northwest, across the Baltic Sea, and into the icy fjords and rugged landscapes of Norse lands. Here, amidst the sagas of gods, giants, and epic battles, you encounter another terrifying form of the undead, the Draugr. These formidable creatures are not merely spirits, they are physical, reanimated corpses, guardians of their hordes, and utterly malevolent forces that embody the darker side of Viking Age supernatural beliefs. You stand on a windswept coastline, the roar of the sea echoing in your ears, the air sharp with the scent of salt and fish. Life in this era is harsh, unforgiving, and deeply intertwined with the cycles of raid, exploration, and battle. Death is a constant companion, but for the Norse, not all deaths lead to the hallowed halls of Valhalla or the tranquil fields of Folkvanger. Some, for reasons both cosmic and mundane, lead to a grim and terrifying undeath. The Draugr, whose name means ghost or revenant in Old Norse, is a central figure in Norse mythology and folklore, appearing frequently in the sagas. Unlike the ethereal Gidim or the ritual-bound Ka of earlier cultures, the Draugr is explicitly a corpse that walks. It retains its physical form, often bloated, discoloured, and possessing superhuman strength. Imagine encountering a Viking warrior, massive and fearsome in life, now returned from his burial mound, his eyes glowing with malevolent fire, his skin the colour of grave earth. That's a Draugr, and it's not interested in pleasantries or tea. You listen to the sagas being recited around a roaring hearth, the flickering firelight casting long dancing shadows on the walls. The tales often speak of the Draugr guarding its burial mound and the treasure within. This mainstream historical fact is a defining characteristic. The Draugr is intimately tied to its grave and its earthly possessions. It is a greedy, territorial entity that will viciously attack anyone who dares to disturb its resting place or attempt to claim its hoard. This isn't just a ghost, it's an angry, undead security system with a penchant for violence. It makes you think twice about raiding ancient tombs, doesn't it? Suddenly, a cursed Egyptian pyramid seems almost inviting by comparison. A quirky or fringe tidbit about the Draugr is their ability to change size and shape, often growing to immense proportions or taking on the forms of animals like seals or cats. Some sagas describe them as being able to sink through the earth or rise from the waves, blurring the lines between physical and spectral. This shape-shifting ability adds an unpredictable element to their terror, making them even more formidable opponents than their already impressive strength suggests. It's like having a zombie that can turn into a giant murderous badger. Fun times. You watch as a group of Norse warriors discuss the proper way to deal with a troublesome Draugr. Unlike many later vampire myths, the Draugr is not necessarily vulnerable to specific aversions like garlic or crucifixes. Instead, their destruction often requires sheer physical prowess, cunning, and sometimes a specific ritualistic act. Beheading and burning the body, then scattering the ashes is a common method, echoing later vampire lore. This emphasis on physical destruction highlights their tangible, corporeal nature. Historians still argue whether the saga's depictions of Draugr reflected actual folk practices of disinterment and dismemberment of problematic corpses, or if they were primarily literary devices to explain bad fortune. The Draugr also possessed a variety of supernatural powers beyond their strength and shape-shifting. They could foresee the future, control the weather, and inflict disease or madness upon the living. This made them truly terrifying adversaries, not just mindless shamblers, but entities capable of malevolent planning and widespread harm. They might appear to the living in dreams, causing nightmares and psychological torment, or simply sit atop their burial mound, radiating ill fortune. Consider the vivid description of Glamour in Greta's saga, one of the most famous Draugr tales. Glamour, a shepherd, dies an unfortunate death and becomes a revenant, growing immensely powerful and terrifying, haunting the district and causing widespread panic. Greta, the hero, eventually defeats him in a brutal extended wrestling match, a testament to the Draugr's formidable physical might. But even after his physical defeat, Glamour curses Greta, leading to the hero's eventual downfall. This shows that even in death, the Draugr's malevolence could linger. The motivations for a person becoming a Draugr were varied. Often it was due to a greedy or unpleasant disposition in life, a strong attachment to earthly possessions, or simply dying in a manner that left them restless, such as being unburied or dying far from home. A warrior who died unglamorously, or a chieftain whose hoard was disturbed, could become a Draugr. It was a terrifying form of spiritual consequence for a life poorly lived, or a death improperly honoured. You imagine the deep fear that would grip a family if a recently deceased patriarch, known for his stubbornness in life, was suddenly suspected of becoming a Draugr. The need to appease, or violently dispose of one's own kin for the safety of the community would be a horrifying burden. This mirrors the intimate terror of the Slavic vampire. The monster is not an external, distant entity, but potentially one of your own. The Norse Draugr contributes significantly to the evolving vampire myth by emphasizing the physicality and malevolence of the reanimated corpse. It is a guardian, a predator, and a powerful supernatural being capable of causing both physical and spiritual harm. While not explicitly a blood drinker in every instance, their general characteristic of draining the life and prosperity from an area, inflicting illness, and their terrifying physical presence aligns them strongly with the broader category of revenants that prey on the living. They are a fearsome evolution of the ancient dread of the unquiet dead, stepping out of the grave and into the sagas, a chilling reminder that some deaths are anything but restful. As you drift away from the harsh, cold lands of the Norse, a chill wind whispers through time, carrying with it the scent of illness and despair. You find yourself plunged into medieval Europe, a vast and tumultuous landscape overshadowed by the twin spectres of plague and famine. This era, a crucible of suffering and profound religious belief, provided fertile ground for the widespread popularization of beliefs in the hungry dead, giving new, terrifying dimensions to the ancient fear of the revenant. You're in a bustling, yet often squalid medieval town. The streets are narrow, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke, refuse, and sometimes the faint, cloying scent of sickness. Life is short, often brutal. Disease, from dysentery to the terrifying Black Death, sweeps through communities with merciless efficiency, decimating populations and leaving behind unimaginable grief and fear. When so many die so quickly, and often without clear explanation, the mind grasps for supernatural causes. Who or what is consuming the life of the village? The church held immense power, offering solace and an explanation for all things, yet even its theological doctrines struggled to fully contain the raw, visceral fear of the undead that simmered beneath the surface of popular belief. While the church emphasized a clear distinction between the living, the souls in purgatory, and the damned in hell, local folklore often painted a grimmer, more immediate picture. The dead could return. This mainstream historical fact is the devastating impact of pandemics, particularly the Black Death, which ravaged Europe from the mid-14th century. Mass graves, bodies piled high, and the sheer incomprehension of the disease's spread fueled anxieties about the dead and their potential for malevolence. When people witnessed their loved ones dying rapidly, sometimes with strange symptoms, and then saw others fall ill in turn, a terrifying logic emerged. The dead were somehow consuming the living, feeding on them. It's a bit like watching a horror movie where the monster isn't some creature from beyond, but your recently deceased neighbour. Much more unsettling, wouldn't you agree? You observe a community struggling to cope with a sudden outbreak of illness. People are dying, and those caring for them often fall ill themselves. The concept of contagion was poorly understood. Instead, whispers begin. He died yesterday, and now his brother is sick. Perhaps he's draining his life. This wasn't just a theoretical fear. It was a practical explanation for the terrifying realities they faced. The dead were not always at peace. Sometimes they were driven by a terrifying hunger, and the living were their unwitting prey. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this period is the belief in earth-eating corpses. Some accounts describe bodies found in graves that appeared to have chewed on their shrouds, or even gnawed on their own flesh or the earth around them. This was interpreted as a sign of undeath, and a manifestation of the corpse's continued horrifying hunger. While modern science would attribute this to post-mortem gas expansion or natural decomposition, in the medieval mind it was undeniable proof that the dead were indeed restless and actively feeding. Imagine the horror of opening a grave and finding not a peaceful skeleton, but a corpse with dirt-stained teeth, enough to make you a permanent vegetarian, I'd say. The medieval revenant wasn't necessarily a dashing, seductive figure. Instead, it was often described as a bloated, discoloured corpse, often with fresh blood around the mouth or eyes, a result of its nefarious activities. It would rise from its grave at night, perhaps to visit its former home, drain the life from its family, or spread disease throughout the village. These creatures were the embodiment of the fear of pestilence and famine, a supernatural explanation for the unspeakable suffering that surrounded them. Historians still argue whether these widespread beliefs were an evolution of ancient pagan revenant myths, or a distinct response to the unique pressures of the medieval period, particularly the plagues. But what is clear is that the fear was deeply embedded in the social fabric. Funerary practices often included precautions, burying bodies face down, placing bricks in their mouths, or even staking them, not yet through the heart necessarily, but through the abdomen or limbs to pin them down. These measures highlight the physical nature of the feared return. You might see villagers discussing strange phenomena, cattle dying mysteriously, crops failing without explanation, or milk curdling. These were all signs that a revenant might be active in the area, drawing away the vital essence of the land and its inhabitants. The vampire of this era was not just a threat to individual lives, but to the very prosperity and survival of the community. It was a drain on the communal vitality, making the hungry dead an even more terrifying adversary. The concept of the suicide vampire also gained traction. Individuals who took their own lives, or those who died outside the rites of the church, like excommunicates or unbaptized infants, were often believed to be particularly prone to becoming revenants. Their souls, denied proper rest, would cling to their bodies, reanimating them to torment the living. This added a layer of theological and moral judgment to the horror, making the deceased's fate a reflection of their earthly sins. It was a terrifying incentive to stay on the straight and narrow, even in death. The church, while often dismissive of superstitious peasant beliefs, sometimes found itself forced to acknowledge and address these fears. Local priests might be called upon to perform exorcisms on suspected revenants or to bless graves, trying to bring peace to the disturbed dead. This constant tension between official dogma and popular belief is a fascinating aspect of the period. The prevalence of grave disturbances and the exhumation of bodies to cure suspected vampirism, which we will delve into later, speaks volumes about the very real belief in these corporeal undead. This wasn't just a story told around the fire, it was a societal problem that sometimes demanded brutal real-world intervention. So in medieval Europe, the vampire, or its myriad local names like Nachtzehrer in Germany, the After-Eater, or the Strigoi in Romania, truly became the physical, plague-spreading, vitality-draining corpse. It was the embodiment of disease, scarcity, and inexplicable death. It was the terrifying answer to the question, why are so many dying? And the answer was, because the dead are not staying dead and they are hungry. This era solidifies the physical, predatory nature of the undead, making them a tangible, horrifying reality in the lives of ordinary people. As the shadow of the Black Death slowly receded, leaving behind a scarred but resilient Europe, the official stance of the Church continued its complex dance with the burgeoning popular belief in the undead. You step into a medieval cathedral, the scent of incense and old stone filling the air, the stained glass windows casting colourful, fractured light across the nave. Here, in the heart of Christian Europe, the rigid theological framework of salvation and damnation clashed, often dramatically, with the visceral, undeniable fear of reanimated corpses. The Church's official doctrine held that the soul, upon death, immediately went to one of three places: heaven, purgatory, or hell. There was no theological room for a soul to remain tethered to its physical corpse, reanimating it to torment the living. Such a notion directly contradicted the concepts of resurrection of the body at the Last Judgment and the immediate fate of the immortal soul. To believe in a walking, blood-sucking corpse was, in the eyes of many theologians, to flirt with heresy. Yet, this mainstream historical fact is the undeniable tension between official church dogma and widespread folk belief. While the Church preached eternal rest or divine judgment, the common person, faced with inexplicable deaths and the terrifying accounts of after-eaters, clung to older, more immediate superstitions. Local priests, often living among their parishioners and witnessing their fears firsthand, frequently found themselves in a difficult position, forced to adapt or tacitly accept practices that veered sharply from official doctrine. Imagine being a priest, trying to explain the intricacies of transubstantiation to a congregation terrified that their recently deceased uncle might crawl out of his grave and start chewing on their cows. It's a tough crowd, to say the least. You observe a village priest, perhaps reluctantly, blessing a grave with holy water, not just for the repose of the soul, but with an unspoken plea to keep the body in the ground. He might even participate in a community ritual to cure a suspected vampire, perhaps advising on the placement of a stake or the burning of a corpse, all while trying to frame it within an acceptable Christian context, casting out a demon perhaps, rather than destroying an unholy dead. This often led to an interesting blend of Christian ritual and pagan countermeasures. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this era is the debate over excommunication as a cause of vampirism. Many believed that individuals who died excommunicated from the Church were prime candidates for becoming revenants. Denied the sacred rites of burial and the grace of God, their souls were believed to be unable to rest, forcing them to animate their corpses. This fear was a powerful tool for maintaining religious conformity and control, as eternal damnation in the afterlife was terrifying enough. But the prospect of returning as a monster to plague your loved ones added a whole new layer of dread. It's like a medieval spiritual credit score. If yours was bad, you might not just lose access to heaven, but gain access to your neighbour's jugular. Theological arguments against the physical revenant often focused on demonic possession. If a body seemed to reanimate, it wasn't the deceased person's soul or a natural phenomenon, but rather a demon inhabiting the corpse. This allowed the Church to acknowledge the visible phenomenon without compromising their theological framework. The solution then became exorcism, treating the reanimated corpse as a vessel for evil, rather than the dead person themselves. Historians still argue whether this reinterpretation was a genuine theological evolution, or a convenient rhetorical strategy to control and explain away persistent folk beliefs. You see learned scholars and monks writing treatises that either condemn the belief in revenants as superstitious nonsense, or attempt to explain them through natural phenomena like unusual decomposition or the effects of disease, or through the lens of demonic activity. This intellectual struggle highlights the deep challenge these beliefs posed to the emerging rationalism and solidified Christian worldview of the time. The very act of having to explain away these phenomena suggests their widespread acceptance among the populace. The Church's fear wasn't just of doctrinal impurity, it was also of public panic and social disorder. If villagers believed they had to dig up graves and perform gruesome acts of dismemberment or burning, it could lead to widespread chaos and challenge the authority of the clergy. Therefore, the Church often sought to control these events, either by condemning them outright or by integrating them into controlled, ritualized actions under ecclesiastical supervision. Consider the role of saints and holy relics in combating perceived vampiric threats. While not directly anti-vampire specific, the power of a saint's bones or a crucifix was believed to ward off all manner of evil, including malevolent spirits and demons inhabiting corpses. This provided a Christian alternative to pagan charms and folk remedies, allowing the Church to maintain its monopoly on spiritual protection. It's like the Church offering a branded spiritual bug spray for all your ghostly problems. The debate also extended to the phenomenon of vampire epidemics, particularly in Eastern Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries, which we'll delve into more deeply soon. When entire villages were gripped by fear and multiple graves were being opened, the Church was forced to send investigators, doctors, and theologians to either debunk the claims or provide explanations that fit within their worldview. This often led to fascinating and sometimes gruesome reports, meticulously detailing the observed phenomena. The Church's attempts to suppress or redefine the vampire myth did not extinguish it. Instead, it sometimes shaped its evolution. The idea of the vampire as an unholy, damned creature, abhorrent to God and sacred symbols, gained traction. This gave the vampire a new dimension, not just a physical threat, but a spiritual one, eternally condemned and forever separated from divine grace. So, while the Church vehemently denied the literal existence of animated corpses drinking blood, its efforts to combat or reinterpret these deeply ingrained folk beliefs often served to reinforce them in new ways. By categorizing them as demonic manifestations or consequences of excommunication, it unwittingly provided a Christian framework for the monster. The struggle between sacred doctrine and superstitious terror ensured that the vampire, far from being dismissed, continued to evolve, taking on new layers of meaning and dread in the heart of medieval Europe. This push and pull set the stage for the dramatic vampire scares that would grip parts of Europe in the centuries to come. You move forward in time, past the late medieval period, to the dawn of the Enlightenment, but find yourself drawn back to the rugged, often isolated villages of Eastern Europe, specifically the Balkan Peninsula during the 17th and 18th centuries. This was the true epicenter of what history now calls the vampire epidemics, periods of intense fear and ritualistic exhumations that gripped communities and ignited a widespread fascination and terror across Western Europe. You are in a remote village, perhaps in Serbia, just as winter begins to loosen its icy grip. The air is still cold, but a palpable sense of unease hangs heavier than the morning mist. A string of unexplained deaths has afflicted the community. A child dies of a wasting sickness, then an elder succumbs to a mysterious fever, and soon after, a young woman suffers from nightmares and a sudden, inexplicable weakness before she too passes away. Fear, like a contagious disease, sweeps through the terrified populace. This isn't just bad luck, this is a pattern, and the villagers know, in their bones, what it means. The mainstream historical fact here is the documented outbreaks of vampirism that occurred in various parts of the Balkans, particularly in the Habsburg monarchy's borderlands. These weren't isolated incidents, but rather periods where multiple deaths within a community were attributed to the actions of a returning corpse, leading to the exhumation of graves and the performance of drastic anti-vampire rituals. The most famous cases, like those of Peter Blagojevich, 1725, and Arnold Powell, 1731, were meticulously reported by local officials, doctors, and even military officers, their accounts translated and spread across Europe, fueling both fear and scholarly debate. Imagine reading a newspaper report that your neighbours are digging up their dead to stake them. It's enough to make you cancel your subscription, isn't it? You observe the villagers, their faces etched with fear and grim determination, gathered around a freshly dug grave. The air is thick with anticipation and dread. They are exhuming the body of the first victim, or the person suspected of being the vampire. When the coffin lid is prized open, what they see, or believe they see, confirms their worst fears. The body is often described as uncorrupted, bloated, with fresh blood on the mouth, or even appearing ruddy and healthy, sometimes with newly grown hair and nails. To a populace unfamiliar with the nuances of decomposition, which can be highly variable depending on soil, temperature and cause of death, these signs were irrefutable proof of undeath. A quirky or fringe tidbit from these investigations is the detailed reports of flexible limbs or bodies that appeared to sigh or groan when a stake was driven through them. These phenomena, now understood as the release of gases from decomposition or muscle rigor, were interpreted by the terrified villagers as undeniable signs of the creature's continued life and suffering. It added a horrific, almost theatrical element to the gruesome exhumations, solidifying the belief in the revenant's vitality. It's like a zombie movie, but with scientific misinterpretations providing the plot twists. The reasons for a person becoming a vampire were varied, mirroring earlier Slavic beliefs: dying a violent or sudden death, being excommunicated, a witch passing over the grave, being born with a caul, or even being bitten by another vampire. The suspicion often fell on those who were already marginalised or unusual in life. Historians still argue whether these vampire scares were genuinely rooted in ancient folk beliefs, or exacerbated by the social anxieties, mass hysteria, and the lack of scientific understanding regarding disease and decomposition during the period. You see the preparations for the cure. Wooden stakes, often made of hawthorn or ash, are sharpened. Garlic is crushed. Axes are readied for decapitation. The body is pierced, sometimes directly through the heart, sometimes through the abdomen, or even pinned to the ground. The blood that sometimes gushed from the corpse, a natural consequence of internal gas pressure, was seen as further proof of its recent feeding. This visceral act, performed in desperation, was believed to finally put the monster to rest, ending its depredations on the community. The reports of these events, often written by bewildered but diligent Habsburg officials, were then translated and disseminated, igniting what became known as the vampire controversy across intellectual circles in Western Europe. Philosophers, theologians, and early scientists debated the validity of these claims, trying to reconcile the seemingly undeniable eyewitness accounts with their emerging rational worldview. This was the first time the vampire truly stepped from the shadows of local folklore into the harsh light of widespread intellectual scrutiny. Consider the detailed report by Imperial Provisor Frombald on the case of Arnold Pauli. He meticulously described the exhumations, the condition of the bodies, and the drastic measures taken, lending an air of chilling credibility to the fantastical accounts. These reports, far from dismissing the phenomena, presented them as observable facts, compelling even skeptical readers to confront the possibility of the living dead. It's hard to argue with a military official's sworn testimony, even if it describes a walking corpse. The impact of these epidemics wasn't just on the local communities. It also fed into the growing body of knowledge, or rather pseudo-knowledge, about vampires. The specific characteristics, bloated appearance, ruddy complexion, fresh blood, and the methods of destruction, staking, decapitation, burning, became codified and widely known. This was the period where the rules of vampirism, as understood by common people, began to solidify. The sheer terror of these epidemics also forced communities to turn inward, examining every unusual death, every strange ailment. It fostered an atmosphere of suspicion and fear, where loved ones could become monsters, and the dead were never truly gone. The vampire was no longer a distant mythological figure. It was the person who died last week, returned to haunt and consume. So, the Balkan vampire epidemics were a watershed moment in the history of the undead. They took the amorphous fear of the revenant, grounded it in real-world observations, albeit misinterpreted ones, and catapulted it onto the European stage. The horrifying details, meticulously recorded, transformed local superstition into a matter of international debate, proving that some fears, once unleashed, refused to stay confined to the graveyard. These tangible accounts laid the groundwork for the vampire's leap from folklore to the literary imagination. Following the chilling echoes of the Balkan vampire epidemics, you find yourself transported directly into the heart of the gruesome cures that these scares provoked. This is where the fear of the undead transformed into desperate, often brutal, actions, where the living literally grappled with the dead, attempting to halt their perceived depredations. It's a messy, visceral and terrifying chapter in the history of the vampire. You stand in a village graveyard, the air heavy with the stench of disturbed earth and something else, a faint, metallic tang. A crowd has gathered, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity, grim determination and outright terror. Before them lies a freshly opened grave, the coffin lid pried off, revealing its horrifying contents. This isn't a scene from a horror film. This was a terrifying reality for communities convinced they were under siege by a revenant. The mainstream historical fact here is the widespread practice of exhuming bodies and performing anti-vampire rituals, often involving dismemberment, staking, or burning during periods of perceived vampirism. These were not isolated incidents, but a systemic response in certain regions, particularly Eastern Europe, to what was perceived as a clear and present danger. The accounts from the Plagojevich and Paule cases, among others, vividly detail these gruesome acts, performed not out of malice towards the deceased, but out of a desperate, terrifying need for survival. Imagine being told that the only way to save your family is to dig up your dead grandfather and put a stake through his heart. It's a decision born of unimaginable fear, wouldn't you agree? You watch as the designated experts, often local executioners, butchers, or even simply the bravest villagers, approach the body. The corpse, if deemed a vampire, might display a range of terrifying signs. An uncorrupted appearance, or conversely one that was too well preserved. A bloated stomach, rosy cheeks, open eyes, fresh blood around the mouth or nose, or even new growth of hair and nails. These signs, now understood as stages of decomposition or post-mortem phenomena, were, to the fearful populace, irrefutable proof that the deceased was feeding. The body itself was the evidence, and its appearance a terrifying confession. A quirky or fringe tidbit from these practices is the belief in some areas that driving a hawthorn stake through the body would produce a groan or scream from the revenant. This sound, caused by the sudden expulsion of internal gases from the decaying corpse, was universally interpreted as the creature's final, agonizing protest, confirming its vampiric nature and the efficacy of the cure. It was the ultimate horrifying confirmation that they had indeed battled and vanquished a monster. It's like your car making a strange noise right before it breaks down, except in this case, the car is a dead person, and the noise means you probably just saved your village. The specific cures varied by region, but often shared common elements. Staking through the heart was perhaps the most iconic and widespread method, believed to pin the vampire to its grave and destroy its unholy existence. But it wasn't the only one. Decapitation was also common, severing the head and often placing it between the legs or at the feet of the corpse, ensuring it could not reattach or see its way back to the living. Burning the corpse to ashes was considered the most definitive method, guaranteeing complete destruction and preventing any reanimation. Sometimes, the ashes were even mixed with water and consumed by the villagers as a gruesome prophylactic. Historians still argue whether the repeated reports of these explicit practices contributed to their popularization, almost like a macabre how-to guide, or if they were independently developed folk remedies. You see villagers placing garlic in the mouth of the corpse or around the grave, its pungent odour believed to repel the undead. Other objects like poppy seeds, which the vampire would be compelled to count, crucifixes, or even fishnets, which it would unravel, were sometimes placed in coffins or graves to delay or deter the revenant. These apotropaic measures highlight the attempt to use specific ritualistic items against a perceived supernatural foe. It's a testament to human ingenuity, or perhaps desperation in the face of the unknown. Consider the role of vampire slayers in these communities. While not organised orders like in later fiction, there were often individuals, sometimes from specific families or with a particular reputation, who were called upon to perform these grim duties. They possessed the knowledge of the signs of vampirism and the proper methods for its eradication, serving a vital, albeit gruesome, role in their communities. They were the original first responders to a supernatural pandemic, The psychological toll on these communities must have been immense. The constant fear, the suspicion directed at the deceased and even their living relatives, and the horrific acts of exhumation and mutilation would have created an atmosphere of profound trauma. Imagine suspecting your recently buried spouse or child of being a monster. The act of curing them was an act of profound desperation and communal protection, overriding any lingering grief or sentiment. The medical and scientific community of the time often responded to these reports with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. Early physicians and anatomists, sometimes sent to investigate these outbreaks, would attempt to provide rational explanations for the observed phenomena, attributing them to natural decomposition, the effects of disease, like tuberculosis, whose symptoms often mimicked vampiric draining or mass hysteria. However, their rational explanations often failed to sway terrified villagers who saw irrefutable evidence with their own eyes. These documented cases of exhumation and ritualistic destruction are a crucial turning point in the history of the vampire. They provided the grisly, tangible details that would later fuel the literary imagination. The images of bloated corpses, stakes through the heart, and the desperate attempts to put the unquiet dead to rest would become the enduring hallmarks of the vampire, shaping its image for centuries to come. The raw, primal fear had been given a set of rules, a protocol, and a set of gruesome solutions. Having witnessed the gruesome rituals of staking and burning, you now turn your gaze to the terrifying forms the undead were believed to take. This isn't about sophisticated charm or brooding allure yet. This is about the raw, visceral dread inspired by the vampire's physical manifestation in the popular imagination, particularly during the peak of the Balkan scares. These descriptions were born from misinterpretations of decomposition, but they fueled a terror far more potent than any scientific explanation. You're standing at the edge of a freshly opened grave, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and the subtle, sickening scent of decay. A group of villagers peer into the coffin, their faces contorted in a mixture of horror and grim confirmation. What they are seeing is not a serene skeletal remains, but something that, to their terrified eyes, is undeniably alive, or at least unnaturally preserved. This physical horror was central to the belief in the Revenant. The mainstream historical fact here is the consistent description of the vampire as a bloated, ruddy, and seemingly uncorrupted corpse during the documented vampire scares of the 17th and 18th centuries. This was the most frequently cited proof of vampirism. Instead of the pale, emaciated figure we associate with modern vampires, the folk vampire was often the opposite, fat and flushed, indicating it had recently fed. Imagine digging up a body expecting a skeletal remains, only to find a corpse that looks like it's just enjoyed a particularly hearty meal. It's enough to make you question everything you thought you knew about death, isn't it? You observe the features of such a suspected revenant. Its skin might appear taut and reddish, sometimes described as having a healthy flush, contrasting sharply with the pallor expected of the dead. This ruddy complexion was taken as evidence of recent blood consumption, the very life of the living now staining the skin of the dead. It implied a gruesome, continued existence, sustained by the very vitality it stole. A quirky or fringe tidbit from historical accounts is the frequent mention of fresh blood around the mouth or nose of the exhumed corpse. This phenomenon, often due to internal gases forcing blood from ruptured capillaries, was universally interpreted as irrefutable evidence of the vampire's recent feeding activity. The sight of blood, still wet and glistening, on a body that should be cold and drained, confirmed every terrifying whisper and rumour. It's like finding crumbs on a child's face after they've raided the cookie jar, except the crumbs are blood and the child is a murderous corpse. Not quite as endearing, I'd venture. The eyes of the vampire were also a source of dread. They were often described as open, staring blankly, or even glowing with a malevolent light. Unlike the sunken, closed eyes of a peacefully deceased body, these open eyes suggested a continuation of awareness, a predatory gaze that refused to be extinguished by death. This uncanny stillness, combined with the apparent vitality, created a profound sense of the uncanny. You might also note the growth of hair and nails on the corpse, another common observation during exhumations. While a natural part of post-mortem processes, the skin receding, giving the appearance of growth, to the terrified villagers, It was further proof of the vampire's continued, albeit unholy, vital functions. It was the body still regenerating, still living, in defiance of all natural and spiritual laws. Historians still argue whether the detailed descriptions of these physical manifestations were consistent across regions due to shared decomposition knowledge or due to the widespread dissemination of vampire manual-type reports. The bloated abdomen was another key sign. This was a result of putrefaction gases accumulating within the corpse, but it was seen as the vampire's distended belly, full from its gruesome nocturnal feasts. Imagine the horror of seeing a corpse that seems to have gained weight in its grave, appearing unnaturally corpulent compared to its state at burial. It directly fed the narrative of the after-eater, consuming not just blood, but perhaps earth, shrouds, or even the vital essence of the living. The sound of the corpse was also important. As we discussed, the groan or sigh when a stake was driven in, or even general gurgling sounds from the grave, caused by gas escaping the putrefying body, were interpreted as the sounds of the vampire's suffering or its continued grotesque life. It was not a silent horror. It was one that made disturbing unearthly noises, adding to the palpable terror. These physical descriptions are crucial because they directly influence the methods of destruction. A bloated body needed to be punctured. A ruddy body implied blood draining. A restless body needed to be pinned. The solutions were a direct response to the perceived physical symptoms. The gruesome details reported by officials and travellers alike cemented these characteristics in the popular imagination, differentiating the vampire from mere ghosts or ethereal spirits. This was a monster with a body, a tangible, terrifying presence that could be seen, touched, if you dared, and ultimately destroyed. Consider the stark contrast with modern literary vampires, typically gaunt, pale, and elegantly aristocratic. The folk vampire was a creature of the earth, often peasant in origin, and physically repulsive. It was the embodiment of decay and corruption, a terrifying reflection of human death gone horribly wrong. There was no romance, no allure, just raw, unadulterated horror. These manifestations were not just visual, they were sensory. The foul odour associated with some exhumed corpses, while being the natural smell of decomposition, was seen as the stench of unholiness, a physical manifestation of the vampire's corruption. It attacked all the senses, making the experience of uncovering a suspected revenant an utterly repugnant and terrifying ordeal. The persistence of these very specific physical traits across various regional accounts suggests a common understanding of what a true revenant looked like. It wasn't just a matter of subjective interpretation, it was a shared horror, a recognised monstrous form that united disparate communities in their fear. This collective recognition gave the vampire its power and its terrifying reality. So, the physical manifestation of the pre-Dracula vampire was far from the suave, elegant figure we know today. It was a grotesque, bloated, ruddy, and often noisy corpse, seemingly vibrant with the stolen life of its victims and perpetually hungry. This terrifying image, born from a desperate attempt to explain the inexplicable horrors of death and disease, was the chilling reality that gripped communities and drove them to undertake the most gruesome of acts. It was the monster in its rawest, most unsettling form, a true nightmare come to life, or rather, come to undeath. Having confronted the gruesome physical reality of the folk vampire, you now delve into the desperate measures taken to combat them. These were not the sleek silver bullets or elegant crucifixes of later fiction. These were the rough, pragmatic tools and talismans of the common people. Born from centuries of oral tradition, desperate experience, and a profound understanding of what the restless dead supposedly abhorred, you find yourself in a dimly lit peasant cottage, its walls adorned with various protective charms. A string of dried garlic hangs near the door, its pungent aroma a subtle shield against unseen dangers. A crucifix, perhaps crudely carved from local wood, is nailed above the hearth. These aren't just decorative items, they're essential components of a daily silent war against the forces of darkness, chief among them the Revenant. The mainstream historical fact here is the widespread use of apotropaic, evil-averting objects and rituals rooted in folk belief, particularly garlic, wooden stakes, and various forms of iron, to ward off or destroy vampires and other malevolent spirits. These practices were deeply ingrained in the lives of communities, passed down through generations and considered as vital as tending to crops or mending fences. Imagine living in a world where your daily safety depends not just on locking your doors, but on hanging a certain herb or burying a specific tool near your loved ones' graves. It adds a whole new layer to your home security system, doesn't it? You observe a woman carefully preparing a wreath of wild rose or hawthorn, believing its thorns would ensnare or deter a returning corpse. These were not random choices. Plants with sharp thorns, strong odours, or religious significance were thought to possess inherent protective qualities. The folk wisdom was meticulously detailed, specifying not just the item, but often its specific type, size, and even the time of day it should be gathered or applied. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the belief in some Slavic regions that a vampire could be prevented from rising by placing a handful of poppy seeds, sand, or millet in its coffin. The vampire, being compelled by some strange obsessive compulsion of undeath, would then be forced to count every single grain or seed before it could leave its grave, effectively trapping it until dawn. This imaginative deterrent reflects a whimsical, almost playful approach to a terrifying problem, imagining the monstrous revenant as having a bizarrely obsessive-compulsive disorder. It's like giving your monster a Sudoku puzzle to keep it busy. The most iconic tool, of course, was the wooden stake. While often associated with the heart, historical accounts show variations. Stakes driven through the abdomen, the chest, or even the limbs, specifically to pin the body to the earth. The type of wood was often specified. Hawthorn, ash, or oak were commonly favoured, perhaps for their perceived mystical properties, or simply their availability and hardness. The act of staking was not merely symbolic, it was a brutal, physical act designed to incapacitate the revenant and prevent its movement. You see a blacksmith hammering a piece of iron, a metal widely believed to repel evil spirits due to its association with purity and its resistance to magical influence. Iron nails were sometimes driven into the grave or coffin, or iron tools placed alongside the corpse. The sheer physical presence of the metal was thought to be an insurmountable barrier for the unholy dead. Historians still argue whether the consistent use of certain materials across disparate regions points to an ancient shared European proto-folk belief, or if it was the result of the spread of documented practices. Garlic, with its strong, pungent smell, was another universal repellent. It was stuffed into the mouth of the corpse, placed in the coffin, hung in windows, or worn as an amulet. Its efficacy was not just symbolic, it was believed to be physically repulsive to the vampire, akin to a spiritual irritant. Imagine the entire village smelling faintly of garlic, a small price to pay for peace of mind, perhaps. Other methods involved water, particularly flowing water like rivers, which were believed to be impassable barriers for the undead. Burial at crossroads between different lands or jurisdictions was also sometimes practiced, perhaps to confuse the revenant or trap it between worlds. These geographical deterrents added a spatial dimension to the protective measures. Consider the role of specific rituals beyond just the objects. The precise timing of exhumations, often at night or before dawn, the specific incantations or prayers uttered, and the involvement of certain individuals, like virgins or those born on a particular day, all contributed to the perceived effectiveness of the cure. It was a precise, almost scientific approach to the supernatural, where every detail mattered. The use of bells or other noisy objects was also sometimes documented, akin to the Roman Lemuria festival. The ringing of church bells or the clashing of metal was thought to drive away evil spirits, including the restless dead. Silence and darkness were the vampire's allies. Noise and light were its enemies. Even the clothing of the deceased could be significant. In some traditions, placing a specific knot in the shroud, or burying the body naked or with torn clothes, was believed to prevent reanimation. It was a form of tying down the spirit, preventing its egress from the burial cloth itself. This attention to detail demonstrates the profound, all-encompassing nature of the fear. These practices illustrate the practical nature of folk belief. They were not abstract theological debates. They were literal, hands-on interventions in a world where the supernatural was a tangible threat. The efficacy of these tools and talismans was proven through empirical observation. When the death stopped after an exhumation and staking, it was evidence that the cure had worked. The human mind, desperate for control in the face of the inexplicable, found comfort in these ritualized responses. So, the pre-Dracula vampire was fought with a surprisingly diverse and consistent arsenal of tools and talismans, sharp stakes, pungent garlic, unyielding iron, and various other materials and rituals designed to physically incapacitate or repel the corporeal revenant. These were the grim, pragmatic responses of a people living with a very real and very terrifying threat emerging from their own graveyards, long before fiction turned the monster into a romantic figure. You journey forward in time, past the tumultuous vampire scares of Eastern Europe, and feel the subtle shift in the intellectual climate. The air grows crisper, filled not with the scent of garlic and disturbed earth, but with the invigorating, often challenging, breezes of Enlightenment skepticism. This was a pivotal era when scientific thought and rational inquiry began to chip away at the bedrock of superstition, challenging centuries-old beliefs, including the very existence of the physical vampire. You find yourself in a bustling Parisian salon, perhaps, or a London coffee house, the clink of porcelain cups mingling with the animated discussions of philosophers, scientists, and intellectuals. The flickering candlelight illuminates debates not about how to stake a vampire, but about the very nature of reality, the power of reason, and the limitations of empirical observation. The detailed reports from the Balkans, once terrifying accounts of a very real threat, were now being scrutinized under the cold, harsh light of a burgeoning scientific method. The mainstream historical fact here is the rise of rationalism and scientific inquiry during the Enlightenment, which fundamentally challenged superstitious beliefs, including the existence of vampires. While not always disproving them directly, the new intellectual framework demanded empirical evidence and logical consistency, forcing traditional beliefs to adapt or recede. Imagine a room full of brilliant minds, sipping tea and calmly dismantling centuries of terrifying folklore with the power of logic. It's a different kind of drama, but no less impactful. You listen as prominent thinkers like Voltaire, though sometimes still prone to the occasional satirical jab at the credulity of the masses, expressed profound skepticism about the documented vampire epidemics. They argued that such phenomena were products of ignorance, fear, and misinterpretation, rather than genuine supernatural occurrences. The notion of a corpse literally rising from the grave to drink blood defied the laws of nature and reason, concepts that were rapidly gaining ascendancy. The medical community in particular played a crucial role in debunking the proof of vampirism. Physicians and anatomists, many of whom had studied the effects of disease and decomposition, began to offer natural explanations for the observed phenomena. The fresh blood around the mouth, a result of internal gas pressure forcing fluids out of the orifices, the bloated appearance, the natural swelling of a decaying body, the groans or sighs, the escape of gases when the corpse was punctured. These were no longer supernatural horrors, but explicable biological processes. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this period is the vampire controversy pamphlets that proliferated across Europe. These were not just dry scientific papers, but often sensationalized accounts, complete with dramatic illustrations that both reported on the Balkan incidents and provided rational explanations. They fueled public fascination while simultaneously attempting to educate, creating a strange blend of fear and enlightenment. It's like a scientific journal that doubles as a tabloid, a truly unique publishing model. You see learned treatises being published that systematically dismantle the vampire myth, citing natural causes for apparent reanimation. These works often detail the various stages of decomposition, the effects of different soil types on preservation, and the symptoms of diseases like tuberculosis, then known as consumption, which caused victims to waste away, appearing pale and weak, leading survivors to suspect a posthumous draining. Historians still argue whether the Enlightenment's rejection of traditional vampire beliefs truly eradicated them, or simply drove them underground, turning them into a more private, less publicly acknowledged fear. The challenge wasn't just scientific, it was philosophical and theological. If nature operated according to predictable laws, then supernatural interventions that defied those laws were problematic. The concept of divine order meant that God would not permit such monstrous aberrations to exist, or at least not without a clear and understandable purpose. The Church, as we've discussed, already had its own reasons for skepticism, preferring explanations rooted in demonic possession or spiritual consequence, rather than the literal reanimation of a corpse. Consider the role of government intervention. In the Habsburg monarchy, where many of the Balkan outbreaks occurred, empirical investigations were ordered. Empress Maria Theresa, influenced by her personal physician Gerard van Swieten, ultimately issued decrees condemning the exhumation and mutilation of corpses as superstitious and barbaric. This top-down imposition of reason played a significant role in stamping out the public vampire scares, even if it didn't eliminate the underlying fear. It's hard to keep a good superstition going when the Empress herself tells you to stop digging up graves. This period also saw the rise of medical jurisprudence, the application of medical science to legal questions, including the determination of death and the explanation of post-mortem phenomena. This emerging field directly contradicted the folk interpretations of vampiric signs, providing a powerful, evidence-based counter-narrative to the supernatural explanations. The Enlightenment's emphasis on individual experience and empirical data ironically both fueled and dismantled the vampire myth. On one hand, first-hand accounts from the Balkans gave the vampire a sense of truth. On the other hand, the demand for repeatable, observable phenomena and the development of tools to explain them ultimately led to its scientific rejection. The vampire, once a terrifying physical reality, became a subject of rational inquiry, a curiosity, and increasingly, a literary device. You feel the intellectual currents shifting. The collective imagination, once dominated by the visceral fear of the undead, was now beginning to embrace a more analytical, yet still curious approach. The vampire became a case study in human credulity and the power of fear, rather than an active threat. This didn't mean the fear vanished entirely, but it transformed. It retreated from the public square and the doctor's report into the realm of the individual mind, the whispered tale, and eventually the printed page. So the Enlightenment marked a crucial turning point. While it didn't immediately erase all belief in the undead, it provided the intellectual tools and the social momentum to reframe the vampire from a terrifying tangible entity into a subject of scientific and philosophical debate, a relic of a less enlightened age. This intellectual shift was essential, preparing the ground for the vampire's next great transformation, from folk monster to literary icon. The stage was being set for a very different kind of bloodsucker. As the Enlightenment's cold light of reason began to dissipate the literal fear of the vampire in intellectual circles, a fascinating phenomenon occurred. The stories didn't die. Instead, they travelled. You find yourself now in the drawing rooms and libraries of Western Europe, where the horrifying accounts from the Balkans, once debated by scientists, were now being devoured by a public eager for exotic and thrilling tales. This was the era when travellers' tales began to fuel and transform the vampire myth, taking it from localised peasant fear to a more widely consumed, albeit still terrifying, curiosity. You're in a dimly lit study, perhaps in a grand manor house in England or a sophisticated hotel, particularly in France. The air is still, save for the crackle of a fire and the rustle of turning pages. On the desk lies a collection of travelogues and philosophical treatises, some sensational, others scholarly, all discussing the recent vampire incidents in distant eastern lands. These accounts, often first-hand reports from military officers, government officials and curious scholars, became the primary conduit for the vampire myth to cross cultural boundaries. The mainstream historical fact here is the dissemination of documented vampire reports from Eastern Europe across Western Europe through published books, pamphlets and journals in the 18th century. Cases like Peter Blagojevich and Arnold Paulet, meticulously detailed by imperial officials, were translated into multiple languages and devoured by a fascinated public. These were not mere campfire tales. They were seemingly authoritative accounts of a phenomenon occurring in remote exotic lands, giving the stories an unsettling air of authenticity. Imagine reading about a real-life zombie outbreak in a far-off land in your morning paper. It was sensational, thrilling, and utterly chilling. You observe an eager reader, perhaps a well-travelled merchant or an adventurous scholar, poring over a translated report. The accounts often emphasise the grotesque physical details, the uncorrupted bodies, the fresh blood, the bloated appearance. These details, which we now understand as misinterpretations of decomposition, were presented as undeniable proof, giving a terrifying concreteness to the abstract idea of the undead. The sheer detail lent a horrifying verisimilitude to the claims. A quirky or fringe tidbit from these travellers' accounts is the often exaggerated or misinformed descriptions of the local folk remedies used to combat the vampires. Some reports sensationalise the methods of staking and dismemberment, turning them into macabre spectacles, while others gleefully detailed bizarre rituals involving everything from wild garlic to the burning of a horse. These embellished accounts often conflated genuine folk practices with misunderstandings or sheer fabrication, adding to the exotic and terrifying allure of the primitive East. It's like a tourist exaggerating about eating bugs in a foreign country, but instead of bugs, it's a reanimated corpse, and instead of eating, it's being staked. The popularity of these accounts can be attributed to several factors. Firstly, the exoticism of Eastern Europe played a significant role. These lands were seen as mysterious, wild, and untouched by the sophistication of Western Enlightenment, making them a fertile ground for inexplicable supernatural occurrences. The otherness of these regions made the horrifying tales more plausible to a Western audience. Historians still argue whether the fascination with these reports was primarily driven by genuine fear, a morbid curiosity, or a subtle critique of Western rationalism. Secondly, the vampire offered a convenient explanation for death and disease that still plagued Western societies, even as scientific understanding grew. While rational minds might dismiss the supernatural, the primal fear of inexplicable illness, especially contagious outbreaks, remained. The vampire provided a terrifying yet understandable narrative for suffering. It was a comfortable horror because it had a clear, albeit brutal, solution. You see artists and writers in the West beginning to sketch and write about these creatures, often based on the traveller's descriptions. The images might be crude, but they begin to standardize the visual representation of the revenant, a grave-bound entity, often associated with darkness and the consumption of vitality. This visual and narrative repetition further cemented the rules of vampirism in the collective consciousness. Consider the role of sensationalism and entertainment. In an era before mass media, these reports served as a form of horrifying entertainment. They were dramatic, gruesome, and touched upon primal fears, offering a thrilling escape from the mundane. The public craved these lurid details, even as intellectuals tried to dismiss them. This inherent entertainment value ensured the story's survival and popularization, regardless of their scientific validity. The accounts also inadvertently contributed to the transformation of the vampire from a purely peasant superstition into a subject of literary interest. The detailed descriptions of symptoms, exhumations, and gruesome rituals provided rich fodder for budding authors interested in the macabre and the gothic. The raw material of folk horror was being delivered directly to the doorstep of the burgeoning literary world. These travellers' tales therefore acted as a crucial bridge. They took the terrifying, localized folk beliefs of Eastern Europe and translated them into a language understandable and fascinating to a broader Western audience. They provided the concrete details, the signs, the methods of destruction, the grisly scenarios that would become the foundational elements of the emerging vampire narrative. The stage was now set for the creature to leap from dry, often disbelieved, reports into the realm of fiction. The vampire was no longer just a horrifying local legend. It was a phenomenon, a subject of curious debate, and soon a character in its own right. As the vivid, gruesome reports from Eastern Europe circulated through Western salons and studies, the vampire, previously confined to the whispers of folk superstition, began to take its first tentative steps into the world of literature. You now find yourself in the intellectual ferment of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, where the raw material of travellers' tales and centuries of fear started to be moulded into something new. Fictional narratives that explored the horror and even the allure of the undead. This was the dawn of the literary vampire, long before Dracula cast his iconic shadow. You're in a dimly lit, slightly dusty library, the air thick with the scent of old paper and ink. Writers, often part of the burgeoning Romantic and Gothic movements, are discovering the rich vein of material offered by the vampire folklore. They're drawn to its inherent drama, the defiance of death, the intimate horror of a loved one returned as a monster, and the unsettling idea of a predatory supernatural being preying on the living. It was all the juicy bits of a good story, wrapped in a shroud. The mainstream historical fact here is the emergence of early literary works that incorporated vampire themes, laying the groundwork for the later, more famous iterations. While not yet full-fledged vampire novels, these stories, poems, and plays explored elements of the revenant myth, translating folk horror into a more refined, often allegorical literary form. Imagine, for a moment, a group of friends gathered on a stormy night, telling ghost stories, and one of them decides to weave in the chilling details from those Balkan reports. That's essentially what was happening, but with considerably more literary flair. You listen as a poet recites verses about a figure consumed by a mysterious illness, his life force slowly draining away, a shadow haunting the living from beyond the grave. These early literary treatments were often less about literal blood drinking, and more about the psychological and emotional impact of the undead, the terror of lingering evil, the curse of undeath, and the profound disruption of the natural order. The horror was often subtle, atmospheric, and deeply unsettling, playing on anxieties about contagion, spiritual damnation, and the enduring power of past wrongs. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this period involves the various attempts to incorporate the scientific explanations of the Enlightenment into the burgeoning fiction. Some writers toyed with the idea of a vampire being a rare medical condition, a form of living death, or a person simply appearing undead due to peculiar circumstances. This created a tension between the supernatural horror and a nascent rationalism, making the stories even more intriguing. It's like trying to write a horror story about a ghost, but then deciding it's actually just a really dusty sheet. Not quite as terrifying, but definitely an interesting narrative choice. The literary precursors were not always coherent or consistent in their portrayal of the vampire. Some drew heavily on the Slavic folk traditions, describing bloated, grotesque figures. Others, influenced by the burgeoning Romantic movement, began to imbue the revenant with a degree of melancholy, an almost tragic air of eternal suffering. This marked a significant departure from the purely repulsive peasant vampire, beginning the slow evolution towards a more complex, even sympathetic villain. Historians still argue whether the initial softening of the vampire's image was a conscious artistic choice, or an unintentional consequence of literary refinement. You see plays being performed where a vengeful spirit, or a cursed individual, rises from the dead to torment their betrayers. These dramatic interpretations brought the undead to a wider audience, often emphasizing the dramatic potential of the revenant, the terror of the return, the inevitable confrontation, and the ultimate destruction. The stage, with its ability to create atmosphere and suspense, was a perfect medium for these early forays into the supernatural. Consider the short but impactful poem The Giaour, 1813, by Lord Byron, which, while not explicitly about a vampire, contains lines that hint at the vampiric curse. But first, on earth as vampires sent, thy corse shall from its tomb be rent, then ghastly haunt thy native place, and suck the blood of all thy race. These verses, imbued with Byron's characteristic brooding romanticism and fascination with the exotic, introduced the idea of the vampire as a cursed, yet strangely compelling figure. This was a significant shift, moving away from pure folk monstrosity towards a hint of tragic grandeur. Another crucial work, often cited as the first true literary vampire story, is John Polidori's The Vampire, 1819, written during the famous ghost story competition at Villa Diodati, the same gathering that birthed Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Polidori's Lord Ruthven is a charming, aristocratic and seductive vampire, fundamentally different from the peasant revenants. Ruthven preys on the innocent, specifically young women, draining their life force not just for survival, but for pleasure. This story introduced the Byronic vampire, unsophisticated, mysterious and dangerously attractive. It was a groundbreaking moment, transforming the vampire from a grotesque local horror into an international aristocratic predator. The themes explored in these early works often included forbidden love, eternal damnation, moral decay, and the consequences of hubris. The vampire, no longer just a physical threat, became a powerful metaphor for various societal and psychological anxieties. It represented the darker side of human nature, the temptations of the forbidden, and the haunting legacy of sin. You reflect on how these early literary ventures began to standardize certain characteristics that would become staples of the vampire mythos. The nocturnal activities, the preying on the vulnerable, the ability to pass as human, and the unsettling charm of the aristocratic vampire, these were all taking shape. The transition from crude folk descriptions to more nuanced literary portrayals allowed for a deeper exploration of the creature's motivations and its terrifying implications for human society. So, the literary precursors to Dracula were diverse, ranging from poetic allusions to fully fleshed-out short stories. They took the raw, terrifying material of the Balkan vampire scares and filtered it through the lens of romantic and gothic sensibilities. This period was crucial because it began the process of transforming the vampire from a local, repulsive revenant into a complex, often seductive, and always compelling figure of horror. The stage was being meticulously set for the grand entrance of the undisputed king of vampires, but not before the romantic movement added its own unique, irresistible touch. Having seen the vampire begin its literary journey, you now witness its profound transformation under the influence of the romantic movement. This was the era that stripped away much of the peasant grotesque and imbued the undead with a melancholic allure, a Byronic brooding, and a dangerous sophistication that would forever change its image. The vampire became less a creature of the grave and more a creature of tantalizing, forbidden desire. You find yourself in a shadowy drawing room, perhaps in 19th century London or Paris. The air is heavy with the scent of gaslight and the faint perfume of the fashionable society that gathers to discuss poetry, art, and the deliciously macabre. The emphasis here is no longer solely on the physical horror of the decaying corpse, but on the psychological torment, the eternal damnation, and the seductive power of a being that defies mortality. The mainstream historical fact here is the Romantic movement's reinterpretation of the vampire as a Byronic hero, a mysterious, charismatic, often aristocratic figure, burdened by a dark past and an eternal curse. This shift was largely initiated by John Polidori's The Vampire, 1819, and the pervasive influence of Lord Byron himself, who embodied the very archetype of the brooding, unconventional and dangerously attractive outsider. Imagine the shock and fascination of an audience accustomed to gruesome, reeking corpses, suddenly presented with a vampire who could charm their way into society's highest echelons and steal not just blood, but hearts. It was a revolutionary and frankly very stylish rebranding. You listen as poets and novelists romanticize the vampire's eternal existence. No longer merely a curse, undeath also becomes a form of tragic immortality, a heightened state of being that allows for endless intellectual pursuits, unrequited love across centuries, and a profound solitary melancholy. The vampire's suffering becomes a source of morbid fascination, transforming the monster into a figure of tragic grandeur. This shift was key. The vampire became a creature to be pitied as much as feared. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this period is the trend of vampire poetry that emerged, often penned by amateur writers influenced by Byron and Polidori. These poems, sometimes published in obscure journals or shared in literary circles, further cemented the image of the vampire as a pale, beautiful and eternally suffering being, haunting not just graves but grand estates and the dreams of innocent maidens. It was a kind of literary fan fiction for the undead, proving that even back then, people loved a good monster with a troubled past. The aristocratic setting became central. The peasant grave dweller was replaced by the noble lord or lady, often foreign and mysterious, with ancient lineage and a stately yet slightly sinister charm. This elevated the vampire's status, making it a creature of power and influence, capable of moving through high society undetected, preying on its most vulnerable members. This added a layer of psychological horror. The monster was not just outside your home, but could be sitting right across from you at dinner, sipping on... well, let's not think about it. Historians still argue whether this aristocratic portrayal was a reflection of societal anxieties about class and social mobility, or simply a convenient narrative device for dramatic contrast. You see characters in these stories drawn to the vampire by a perverse fascination, a dark allure that defies reason and morality. The act of being bitten, while terrifying, also became an act of perverse intimacy, a merging of souls, a forbidden transcendence. The vampire no longer just drained life, it offered a dark form of eternal life, a chilling seduction into its cursed existence. This sexualization of the vampire, though often subtle and implicit, was a major innovation of the Romantic era. Consider the archetype of the fatal man, or femme fatale, which the Romantic vampire embodied perfectly. They were beautiful, dangerous, and irresistible, drawing victims into a web of destruction not through brute force, but through captivating charm and hypnotic power. This shifted the nature of the vampire's threat from physical assault to a more insidious psychological seduction. the victim was not merely killed, they were ensnared, often willingly, by a creature that offered a terrifying alternative to mortal life. The settings of these stories often move from the gritty graveyards to grand, decaying castles, moonlit ballrooms and remote, desolate landscapes. The atmosphere became crucial, melancholic, evocative, and deeply gothic. The vampire thrived in these shadowy, atmospheric environments, symbolising the darker passions and hidden desires that lurked beneath the veneer of polite society. The themes of lost innocence, forbidden knowledge, and the boundary between life and death became central. The vampire, an entity that defied death yet was cursed by it, explored these philosophical questions with a chilling immediacy. Its eternal suffering and its perpetual hunger became metaphors for human longing, sin, and the consequences of moral transgression. The romantic vampire also introduced a degree of sympathy for the creature. Its immortality was often presented as a lonely burden, its predatory nature a tragic necessity, and its eternal existence a form of damnation. This complexity added depth to the monster, making it more than just a figure of fear, but an object of a strange, unsettling empathy. You might still be terrified, but now you also feel a pang of pity for its eternal plight. This transformation was critical for the vampire's future. It elevated the creature from the realm of mere superstition into the complex, psychologically rich tapestry of high literature. It provided the template for the vampire as we largely understand it today, a figure of elegant horror, aristocratic allure, and profound, often tragic, mystery. The crude, bloated revenant of the Balkans was gone, replaced by a sophisticated predator capable of inspiring both fear and a strange, undeniable fascination. The stage was now perfectly set for the most famous vampire of all to step into the spotlight. You stand on the precipice of the late 19th century, the era of Victorian England, where gas lamps cast long, flickering shadows on cobbled streets, and the industrial hum of progress mingled with the lingering anxieties of a changing world. It is here, in this fertile ground of scientific advancement and societal unease, that all the threads of ancient fears, medieval terrors, Enlightenment skepticism, and romantic allure finally converge, culminating in the indelible image of the vampire that would dominate popular culture for generations. This is the moment when the scattered echoes of the past coalesce, and Dracula looms. You're in a richly appointed London drawing room perhaps, or a foggy, wind-swept coastline in Whitby. The air is thick with the scent of old leather and the faint, sweet smell of gas. People whisper about strange occurrences, about peculiar foreign visitors, and about an inexplicable chill that seems to pervade the very fabric of society. The pre-Dracula vampire, in all its myriad forms, has laid the groundwork, patiently building its mythology brick by terrifying brick. The mainstream historical fact here is the publication of Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1897, a novel that synthesized centuries of disparate vampire folklore into a single, cohesive, and utterly compelling narrative. Stoker drew from the Slavic revenant, the Vrikolakas concept, which he researched. The aristocratic allure of Polidori's Lord Ruthven, the historical figure of Vlad the Impaler, whose patronymic, Dracula, means son of the dragon or son of the devil, and the broader anxieties of Victorian society. He didn't invent the vampire, but he perfected its literary form, creating an iconic villain that resonated deeply with the cultural moment. Imagine all those previous shadowy figures, the bloated corpses, the seductive lords, the terrifying animals, all rolled into one impossibly powerful and charismatic entity. It was, and remains, a masterpiece of synthesis. You follow the narrative as Stoker masterfully blends the primal horror of the folk vampire with the sophisticated dread of the Romantic era. Dracula is physically strong and monstrous, capable of controlling animals and the elements, echoing the Driga and early revenants. Yet he is also an ancient nobleman, articulate, alluring, and capable of charming his victims, a direct descendant of Polidori's Ruthven. This dual nature, beast and aristocrat, made him uniquely terrifying and compelling, a quirky or fringe tidbit from Stoker's research, though not explicitly in the novel, is his likely encounter with the theories of Cesare Lombroso, an Italian criminologist whose theories of atavism suggested that criminals were throwbacks to earlier, more primitive human forms, often identifiable by physical traits. While Stoker didn't make Dracula a literal criminal, the idea of a degenerate or primitive power lurking beneath a veneer of sophistication resonates with Lombroso's theories, adding a scientific, albeit flawed, layer to the monster's horror. It's like finding a hint of Neanderthal in your elegant dinner guest, deeply unsettling. The novel taps into the anxieties of the late Victorian era, fears of foreign invasion, contagion, remember the plague parallels, the crumbling of traditional morality, and the rising power of female sexuality. Dracula, an Eastern European outsider invading England, embodies these fears, threatening to corrupt English women and undermine the established order. The vampire, once merely a regional terror, became a symbol of societal decay and the insidious encroachment of the unknown. Historians still argue whether Stoker's portrayal of Dracula was a deliberate commentary on specific Victorian anxieties or a culmination of broad cultural shifts over centuries. You see the familiar elements coalescing: the vulnerability to sunlight, the need for blood as sustenance, the aversion to holy symbols, crucifixes, holy water, the method of destruction, staking through the heart, and the power of garlic. Stoker meticulously incorporated and codified these elements from centuries of folklore and earlier literary works, cementing them as the standard rules of vampirism. He gave the disjointed mythology a consistent, horrifying logic. Consider the narrative structure of Dracula, told through journal entries, letters, and newspaper clippings. This epistolary style gave the fantastic tale an air of chilling realism, mimicking the sensation of reading those very same factual reports from the Balkan epidemics of the previous century. It blurred the lines between fiction and horrifying possibility, making the reader feel as if they were uncovering a real-life horror. The character of Van Helsing represents the convergence of old and new methods, a man of science, doctor-philosopher, who also understands and respects the power of ancient superstitions. He is the intellectual bridge, demonstrating that sometimes old fears require old solutions. His presence reinforces the idea that conventional science alone cannot combat such an ancient primordial evil. The female vampires in the novel, often seductive and dangerous, reflect the Victorian fascination with and fear of female sexuality and its power to corrupt. They are beautiful, alluring and utterly predatory, drawing upon the Greek Lamia and Empousa, as well as the more recent romantic vampirettes. They symbolise the dangerous allure of the forbidden, a stark contrast to the pure, innocent heroines they seek to corrupt. The climax of the novel, the pursuit of Dracula back to his Transylvanian castle, and his ultimate destruction, provides a definitive resolution. The monster is vanquished, the natural order is restored, and the forces of good triumph. This satisfying conclusion, however, doesn't erase the deep, lingering sense of horror that Dracula had introduced. So Dracula is not merely another vampire story, it is the vampire story, the culmination of millennia of human fear. It takes the earliest anxieties about the restless dead, the Mesopotamian Giddim, the Egyptian unquiet Ba, the Greek Lamia, the Roman larvae, the Slavic vampire, the Norse Drauga, the medieval hungry corpse, the documented terrors of the Balkan epidemics, and the elegant dread of the Byronic hero, and weaves them into a single, terrifying, and unforgettable tapestry. Bram Stoker gave the pre-Dracula vampire its ultimate form, transforming a chaotic collection of fears into a singularly powerful and enduring myth. The journey of the undead, from whispering dread to iconic horror, finds its defining moment here, forever stamping the image of the vampire into the collective human consciousness. As the final words of Dracula's tale echo in the quiet of your room, the shadows deepen, and the hum of the fan becomes a soothing lull. The journey through millennia of fear, from the primal anxieties of cave dwellers to the sophisticated terrors of Victorian England, now gently unwinds. You've seen the restless dead take countless forms, each one a mirror reflecting the deepest human fears of its age: disease, famine, the unknown, and the horrifying thought that death might not be the end, but merely a transformation into something monstrous. The vibrant imagery of ancient rituals, the chilling reports from distant lands, and the elegant dread of literary figures begin to fade, replaced by a sense of calm. The frantic pace of our historical exploration softens now, like a gentle tide receding from the shore, leaving behind a peaceful stillness. You recall the Mesopotamian priests chanting their exorcisms, the Egyptian embalmers meticulously preparing for eternal rest, the Greek Lamia praying in the shadows, and the Roman paterfamilias rattling his pots against the lemures. Each whisper of fear, each desperate ritual, was a testament to humanity's enduring struggle with the mysteries beyond life. Think of the terrified Balkan villagers, their hands grimly digging into the earth, desperate to end the depredations of the bloated vampire. Imagine the grim determination in their eyes as they applied the hawthorn stake, believing they were saving their community. These weren't just stories. They were once lived realities, born from incomprehensible suffering and a desperate need for explanation. The sharp, pungent scent of garlic, the cold touch of iron, the specific, almost ritualistic acts of decapitation and burning, all were born from a primal terror of a physically reanimated corpse, a creature that defied the natural order. But then, the light of reason, the Enlightenment, began to challenge these visceral beliefs. The intellectuals, the scientists, the philosophers, they sought to explain away the horror, to rationalize the inexplicable, turning the supernatural into the natural. The vampire, for a time, became a mere misinterpretation, a phenomenon of gases and decomposition, rather than a genuine entity. Yet, as so often happens with deep-seated fears, it simply retreated, finding new avenues to express itself. And those avenues were paved by the adventurous tales of travellers bringing the sensational, often exaggerated accounts of Eastern European vampire scares to the curious audiences of the West. The grotesque details, the terrifying descriptions of physical revenants seeped into the collective consciousness, preparing the ground for something more refined, more seductive. The raw folk monster was about to get a makeover. Then came the romantics, those brooding poets and passionate novelists who looked at the decaying corpse and saw not just horror, but tragedy. They imbued the vampire with melancholy, with aristocratic charm, with a dark allure that was irresistible even as it promised destruction. The creature became a Byronic hero, cursed yet compelling, eternally suffering yet eternally powerful. The act of vampirism, once a brutal drain, became a perverse seduction, a forbidden intimacy, a dark promise of immortality. And finally, all these currents converged in the masterful hands of Bram Stoker. He didn't just write a book, he wove together millennia of fear, folk belief, scientific skepticism, and romantic fascination into a single, cohesive, and terrifyingly iconic figure, Count Dracula. Stoker's vampire was everything the pre-Dracula vampire had been. The physical horror, the aristocratic seducer, the embodiment of foreign invasion and moral corruption. He created not just a character, but an archetype, a synthesis of all the restless dead that had haunted humanity since the dawn of time. So as you close your eyes, perhaps there's a flicker of that primal fear, a whisper of the ancient dread that the dead do not always stay dead. But know that this journey has brought us to the very threshold of the modern vampire, a creature born not just of darkness, but of human imagination, constantly evolving to reflect our deepest anxieties and our most forbidden desires. The pre-Dracula vampire in all its chilling forms laid the foundation, ensuring that the king of vampires would forever reign in the shadows of our dreams. May your own sleep be peaceful and undisturbed.